Hello, everybody. Hi, it's 6 o'clock, and welcome back to the Skyscraper Museum's Book Talk series, our monthly talks on subjects of New York history, skyscrapers, urban history, and beyond. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the director of the Skyscraper Museum, and I'm welcoming everybody to this program where we're exploring Staten Island with the author Kenneth Gold, whose book came out. It's on the screen, but I'm gonna hold it up here too. Whose book called The Forgotten Borough, Staten Island, and the Subway. Spoiler alert, there is no subway to Staten Island. We have a counterfactual on the exploration of this history, whose book came out in April and is a wonderful history of Staten Island's development over centuries. And with respect to mass transit and issues, as in the bridge, as you see on his cover, as well as the tunnels that don't exist, transportation and Staten Island are the kind of destiny of that borough that Ken explores in his book. Ken Gold is a professor of educational studies at the College of Staten Island, which is a CUNY campus, where he's the founding dean of the School of Education there. And he's also the author of Schools In, a history of summer education in American public schools, which he published in 2002. But as I said, the Forgotten Borough is his new book. It is a scholarly work with, I think, close to 80 or 90 pages worth of footnotes and an immense amount of history and verbiage on every page. So he's going to give us a sample of about 30 minutes or so. Ken Gold is as I said, a professor. He's a historian. He did his undergraduate degree, bachelor's in American history at Princeton, and then he did his master's and his PhD at the University of Michigan. So he's someone who is schooled in historical thinking and takes this interesting approach in this book to the counterfactual of Staten Island and the subway. So let me invite Ken Gold. Take it over, Ken.
Thank you so much, Carol. And I really want to thank you for inviting me to speak tonight and for all the work that you did and that Dan did to make this event happen. I'd also like to share one anecdote. When I was pitching this book project to Columbia University, they asked whether it was for a scholarly audience or a general audience. And I said, it's both, because it's really meant to be kind of in between, written at a sort of a level in between scholarly and general, but that if I had to err towards one side, it would be towards a general audience, because I do think that there's a lot of people interested in New York City history, Staten Island history, and certainly the subway and other transportation matters. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about both Staten Island and its failure to link to the subway. And I'm going to start with Staten Island, known by many as the Forgotten Borough, and hence the title of this talk and my book. Oh, hold on. And you'll see that this notion of Staten Island being forgotten is something that lots of folks in New York City, whether living on Staten Island or the mayor of New York, or a local Staten Island newspaper or the New York Times, commented on already in the first half of the 20th century, right? It's the Cinderella. It considers itself put upon. It's the stepchild. But more than any of those monikers, the Forgotten Borough became most commonly known or most commonly used. And I think that moniker functions as a form of, in multiple ways. It speaks to the island's self-identity as it views, and its residents view, their treatment by the rest of the city. It speaks to its otherness, how residents of the rest of the city often see Staten Island as apart or different. And finally, it functions, I think, as an explanation for why Staten Island is so different in many ways from the rest of the city. Now, I want to start with a very particular remarkable transformation. And that occurs over a century. In 1894, Staten Island is not yet part of New York City. The 5 boroughs don't exist. Brooklyn is a separate city. But there's a lot of talk about consolidating and creating a greater city of New York. And there's a referendum held in these 4 areas, as well as some other communities that end up not joining the city. And you'll see that while all 4 areas voted in favor, and that it was, a razor-thin margin in Brooklyn. And quite frankly, if Brooklyn hadn't voted in favor, it probably would have killed the whole project. But you see an overwhelming vote in favor by Staten Island, 78%. Now let's jump 100 years later to the early 1990s, when Staten Islanders are frustrated by a number of developments in New York City, particularly in terms of how its government is going to be changing its structure. And 83% of its citizens want to have a succession study committee. And then when it's time to actually vote on whether or not to do it, 65% vote in favor. And this data begs the question, the first poll survey begs the question of why would Staten Island want to join New York, and why would New York want it? And I think the easiest way to try to answer that is to take a look at the harbor. This is really the consolidation movement is conceived of a way of generating much greater efficiency in the harbor of New York. Now, obviously, there's parts of New Jersey that border the harbor, and those state boundaries aren't anything that the proponents can deal with, but at least the other areas, and Staten Island lies right at the entrance to the harbor, those other areas can be brought into a single jurisdiction and with the purpose of kind of creating a better use of its harbor. A secondary reason, but arguably no less important actually, is New York is eager to maintain its status as the nation's first city and its most important and most populated city. And its population is not growing as quickly as Chicago's. And in fact, in 1889, Chicago annexes some of its outer districts. And so all of a sudden, it's only about 400,000 or 500,000 people smaller than New York, which is that time is still Manhattan and a small part of what is now the Bronx. And so New York wants to maintain its supremacy. As far as why Staten Island voted overwhelmingly to join, it was not actually a mass movement, right? It is really conceived and promoted by members of its professional elite who operate out of a vision of civic greatness. On the one hand, that's sort of their idealism, but they also have the very practical interest in generating higher property values. The sort of the property class and the realtors on Staten Island are all very much in favor of this development. And they articulate this vision not just of a growth in its population, but they actually see it as becoming a center of commerce and industry if it becomes part of the city. But it wouldn't have gotten such an overwhelming vote if it hadn't had some appeal to people beyond the sort of the wealthy. And that appeal is harder to understand today, where cities, for the last, 50 years, cities have often been posited as sort of the places of failed governance. But in the early years of the 20th century, in the late 19th, cities were the most creative and advanced in sort of providing services, whether it's water, whether it's an organized fire department or street cleaning. These are things that cities are providing that the communities on Staten Island, which is made up of towns and some villages and some unincorporated areas, are not really providing. And so the hope for improved public services, particularly internal and external transportation, are seen by less privileged residents as being the crucial benefit. And there's this sense among many that sort of ultra or hyper localism just isn't efficient. And there's the story that's likely apocryphal of, a fire company in one village sees smoke in the distance and starts rushing towards it, but stops when it reaches the end of its jurisdiction and it still hasn't reached the fire, and turns around and goes back because it's not its problem. And one of the leading proponent on Staten Island is a man named Erastus Wyman, a businessman, and he talks explicitly about free bridges, free ferries, and a free tunnel under the bay to Brooklyn as arising out of consolidation. The process to consolidate lasts nearly a decade, and it's a long story that I'm not going to go into now. But on January 1, 1898, at the time was referred to as Greater New York, is established with 4 boroughs: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, then the borough of Richmond. And the Bronx will become a borough. The Bronx, what is now the Bronx, joins the city. It's initially part of Manhattan, and it breaks away within 20 years. One outside perception of Staten Island that nearly derails its inclusion in Greater New York is the notion that it's not urban enough. It's too rural. And one of the interesting findings that I did is I investigated that proposition and really discovered, obviously compared to downtown Brooklyn or New York, it is not at all urban, but I compared it to the other outer boroughs. And by a couple of measures, it is just as, if not more urban, than Queens. While its population is smaller than Queens, it's also smaller in terms of square miles. And so its actual population density is greater than Queens. And it also has 60% of its population in 1890 living in 2 incorporated villages that are, pretty close, at the closest point towards New York or near that. It has a plurality of its labor force working in manufacturing and mechanical pursuits. It is 62% of its population in 1890 is foreign-born or child of a foreign-born resident. And it even has an Irish-dominated democratic political machine at the county level. So it's not astounding that Staten Island would join at that time. It's not all that different from the other outer parts of New York. And consolidation does have an impact on the borough. It gets some new public structures, most notably its first library, its first high school building, and its magnificent borough hall. Its legal entities consolidate. 5 townships and 4 villages become a single borough. Its 29 separate school districts now become a single unit in the New York City Board of Education. But it never gets a subway, as Carol noted. And the subway is really just the tunnel because it already has its own internal railroad network that it's just eager to connect to New York City's subway. And the lack of a subway sends Staten Island on a very different trajectory. And you look at the populations of the Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island in 1890. And as I said, Staten Island is the smallest, but they're in the same ballpark, all under 100,000. And 40 years later, by 1930, the Bronx and Queens are both well over 1 million, and Staten Island's population has reached 158,000. So clearly something has happened in those boroughs, and other things have and that have not happened in Staten Island, and that something is the arrival of the subway. Now, there are multiple moments of possibility for Staten Island to obtain a subway. And notice I'm saying possibility. I am not arguing that Staten Island ever had a great chance of getting a subway. It was always a long shot, but it was not an impossibility. And there are certain moments in time when connecting the subway to Staten Island was attempted. And in fact, even when it wasn't attempted, it was plausible. As many of you might know, the city's first subway opens up in 1904, but the contracts with August Belmont's Interborough Rapid Transit Company, you may know of it as the IRT, were signed 4 years earlier, and so the jockeying for expansion of that initial subway begins even before the first line opens. And any subway expansion has some key issues that are going to play out over the next 40 years. One is New York City's debt ceiling. The state constitution does not allow a community to borrow more than 10% of its assessed property valuation. And so there's this debt ceiling, and it has to limit what New York City can borrow to build something. There's also New York City's caught up in the first part of the 20th century in political conflict between sort of the democratic machine and reformist or fusion movements that are trying to run the city. And there's sort of a back and forth between when a machine politician gets elected mayor and control of the government, and when reform politicians. There's also lots of communities jockeying for particular lines. And so Staten Island's always, vying with, neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx for a subway line. And then even on Staten Island, there's a lot of disagreement over which line to pursue and what direction and what location and what type, and even whether the biggest need of Staten Island in terms of transportation is the subway. And there are those who just say, make the ferries much more efficient. In my book, I argue that there are 6 kind of moments where a subway was more plausible than not, than the other periods. And of those 6, I focus on the 3 that I think are most plausible. And of those 3, I'm going to talk mostly about the one that I really think more than any other is Staten Island's missed moment. The most well-known moment is when Mayor John Hyland actually breaks ground for a Staten Island to Brooklyn tunnel under the Narrows in 1923. But this is not the moment. So I'm putting this up here literally to convince you that, or to try to convince you that the most well-known episode is not, and it's one where they actually dug 2 shafts and spent, between $5 and $6 million. And eventually the project is blocked and they fill in the shafts, and, that's that. But it's still not the greatest possibility, in my view. And instead, I want to talk to you about the dual contracts. Now, this is not a great map in terms of, I know it's hard to actually read it, but you don't need to read it. The reason why I argue that the dual contracts are the most important, I'll get to in a moment. Let me just explain what the dual contracts are. Most people who know the subway acronyms know that there's the IRT, and then you may remember the BMT. But the BMT was originally the BRT, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, and the dual contracts are contracts with those 2 companies agreed upon in 1912 and signed in 1913 to expand the subway system. And it is by far the largest expansion of the subway system in New York City's history. The plan emerges out of something that had been called the Tri-Borough Plan in earlier years, which was also meant to expand the system. But the initial intent of the Tri-Borough Plan was for it to be city-run. And that's just not viable in the current political and fiscal context of, 1908, 1909, when the Tri-Borough is being discussed, and it finally fails in 1910. The man primarily behind the dual contract proposal is the Manhattan Borough President, George McEnany, who had just taken office in 1909. And before that, he was the head of a prominent reform organization known as the City Club. So, and his intent is, with this expansion, to disperse Manhattan's population into the outer boroughs. So this is an effort to really decongest Manhattan, particularly lower Manhattan, by enabling people to move much further out. And therefore, the lines that emerge as part of this proposal reach into the outer parts of the borough. And that's what I want you to see. A line going out into the middle of Queens, lines going down all the way to Coney Island, Brooklyn. These areas are not very populated. And in the Bronx, lines going out all the way nearly to the Westchester border. So by design, these lines would lead to the development of these areas. And so one reason why I think this was a potential moment for Staten Island is because Staten Island too is relatively empty. And so philosophically, at least, a line to Staten Island would have been consistent with this approach of trying to disperse Manhattan's population. McEnany, though, has to do a lot of negotiating with these two companies because they don't want to build lines to outlying areas because they rightfully conclude those lines aren't going to be profitable right away. And so what McEnany does is he, in addition to the lines that are moving further out, he also allows and they develop new lines that are going to be in downtown Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn. And those lines are meant to be profitable right from the get-go. They are going to ease congestion in the already congested areas and not try to move people out, just simply try to make transportation a little bit easier for those folks. And so the packages that were put together for the IRT and the BRT sort of combined these short local, routes in congested areas with these longer routes to outlying areas, so that overall there was an opportunity to make profit. Another reason why Staten Island comes up, it's frustrating that it comes up short, is because the Board of Estimate, which is what McEnany is part of, and this is the key governing body of New York City at the time, has each borough president on it. So Staten Island's borough president, George Cromwell, sits on the Board of Estimate, but the Board of Estimate doesn't determine the subway growth, right? Subways, as you know, even today, right, when the MTA wants to do something, it has to get approval from the state and not just the city. So the state has an entity called the Public Service Commission, the PSC, and that body is assigned the task of planning new subways. Now, it's not going to be able to plan anything that the city doesn't approve of, but the city itself doesn't get to chart its own course. And so the Board of Estimate creates a subcommittee to work with the PSC. McEnany is on that subcommittee. It's a subcommittee of 3, and so is Staten Island's borough president, George Cromwell. So to some extent, he is in, to sort of paraphrase Hamilton, he is in the room where it happens, right? He is in the room where there are discussions and negotiations. And unfortunately, those were closed discussions, and we don't actually have records of what transpired. But we do know that the net result of those those discussions are that Staten Island is not included in the dual contracts. And we know a couple of other things from my archival research, including the McEnany papers down at Princeton, which are filled with some insight into this. For one thing, very early in the process, McEnany identifies the points in which the members of the subcommittee and the PSC are in disagreement. And a route to Staten Island is not listed as one of them. And what's more, McEnany and Cromwell are in agreement on every major point. A second key piece of evidence that I really had fun with in this book is looking at the earlier drafts of a report that comes out in 1911, June 1911, that announces the dual contracts. And the earliest drafts have a very small appendices, but they're expanded in later drafts. And one of them is a very curious letter from Cromwell to the rest of the committee, kind of making the case for Staten Island and, saying this is still going to be in our eventual plans, even though it's not here now. And it's very clear to me that this is a form of political cover for Cromwell, because he knows he's going to get a lot of flack from his constituents for failing to have Staten Island included in the dual contracts. Cromwell had been Staten Island's first and only borough president. When he has to run for re-election in 1913, this issue of failing on the dual contracts is a big one, and he's defeated. It's not the only reason why he's defeated, but it certainly is one of them. So he really kind of pays the price for not making this happen. The Narrows Tunnel was included as a possible extension, but it doesn't really happen, in part because the economics of the subway change as the subway expands. The initial subway route was unbelievably lucrative, the one that opened in 1904. And the routes in the dual contract, in part because not all of them were profitable, were never as lucrative as they had hoped. Eventually, the BRT has to declare bankruptcy and reorganizes as the BMT. And so the Staten Island approach just doesn't happen. I would say that the tunnel that Mayor Hyland tried to do in 1923, had a chance, but not a good one, because Hyland was pitted himself against the fledgling Port Authority of New York, which had only been created in 1921, but it had the backing of New York State Governor Al Smith. And so the state blocks the tunnel effort that Hyland wants to build. The final thing I want to just sort of mention is the third episode that I think, I don't know that it had a great chance, but I'm struck by two aspects of it. This is a plan that the Richmond County chapter of the New York Society for Professional Engineers puts together in the 1930s. And, they're imagining both a subway and these black lines are the existing railroad on Staten Island. And they're saying we do need one cross-county loop, and maybe possibly we'll have an extension to Tottenville along the west side of the island. And it is interesting to me for two reasons. One, they're still pushing for a subway in the 1930s. And one of the things that's already started to change in the urban transportation scene is the automobile sort of culturally comes into its own in the 1920s, and it's just expanding and expanding ever since. And so to me, that there's already people still pushing for a subway, even as the automobile is gaining momentum, is striking. And then the second piece is because it happens in the 1930s, they're no longer trying to convince the city. They're actually trying to get to pay for it. They're trying to get access to New Deal funds and the federal government. But they fail because they can't do it without the city's blessing, and LaGuardia never gives it to them. So without conclusions of my book are basically that Staten Island doesn't begin as an anomaly. It was transformed into one primarily by its lack of rapid transit access. And while its cultural ambivalence towards New York is historic, right? The first secession talk on Staten Island happens within a decade of it joining. But nonetheless, joining the city. But nonetheless, it's tilted towards embracing the city early on and resenting it in the latter part of the 20th and 21st century. And finally, historically, that Staten Island's ability to forge its own destiny is severely limited by its powerful neighbors and organizations to the north and east and west. With or without a tunnel, Staten Island can't avoid certain developments that happen no matter what. The chief one is, say, deindustrialization. First half of the 20th century, Staten Island has a number of factories, most of which close in the second half, in mid-century and the latter part of the century. Staten Island also grows more politically conservative already by the 50s. That's notable, and I think its isolation contributes to that. What should we make of the Verrazzano Bridge, right? Staten Islanders still want a connection. They largely are in favor of the Verrazano and acquiesce to Robert Moses's resistance to rapid transit on it. But the Verrazzano Bridge was never really about Staten Island. It was not at all about developing Staten Island. It is about connecting New York City, other than Manhattan, to the highway network that is developing throughout the rest of the country. And so the allowing of transportation of goods through the city to Long Island and New England without having to go through Manhattan. Obviously, there's a lot more in the book, but I think I'm going to stop here. We're just about at the time frame of 30 minutes, which was our aim. And I hope you'll have lots of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. That was absolutely fascinating. And I neglected to mention in the introduction that you are a historian and a co-editor, a historian of Staten Island, obviously, but the co-editor of a book on the history of Staten Island that looks back, how many years? 300 years?
350. We did it to commemorate the 350th anniversary of Staten Island's settlement by Europeans. Of course, there was a Native American presence on Staten Island before that.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that project too, as we wait. And let me remind people that if you have questions, put them in the chat, address them to the Skyscraper Museum, and then I'll take a look at those and try to incorporate that into our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, that project was came out of a really wonderful effort that was organized by a colleague, Lori Weintraub, who's my co-editor on that, out of Wagner College, that really wanted to commemorate the 350th anniversary. So there were a series of events that were that we ran. We did programming in schools, and my role was to help edit this collection. What we did was we identified 350 significant locations on Staten Island, some historic, some current, but made it sort of like a dictionary of 350. And we organized them along 12 themes. And so each month we had an event that related to one of the themes. In addition to co-editing the entire book, the chapter that I oversaw was the chapter on transportation. And so I included, for example, the location of the shaft that they dug when Mayor Highland broke ground in 1923. But I also included things like, obviously, the Verrazano Bridge and the Goethals and the other two bridges to New Jersey, things like highways, things like old post roads. Interestingly enough, a lot of the roads on Staten Island, the major roads, really reflect the stagecoach routes from 150, 200 years ago. And we had other chapters. I'm trying to, we had the arts, we had sports, we had sort of economics, and a host of others.
And was that a project that was sponsored by a museum or the borough president?
The borough president contributed, I think, some funds to it. It didn't have a single sponsor, and we did a small amount of fundraising from various sort of Staten Island entities, and then published it. And it's it didn't have a single sponsor, but if I recall, there's a nice opening letter from the borough president, from Mayor Bloomberg, who was mayor at the time, and so it had a lot of civic support.
So there's one famous aspect of your transportation system that you haven't talked about yet, and that's the ferry. Do you have something to tell us about that?
Sure. Well, I don't know if most people know this, but the ferries predate, the ferries were established on Staten Island in the mid 19th century by the Vanderbilt family. It's the initial origins of the Vanderbilt's wealth was the ferries that they ran from Staten Island, primarily to Manhattan. Then they built that internal railroad that you saw on the map that wasn't in red, that was in black. That was built in the mid 19th century as well. Certainly predates Staten Island becoming a borough. And so again, that's something that they built initially, but quickly sold it to a separate company. And eventually the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad takes over ownership and runs it for a while. And so that railroad was both carrying passengers, but the route that went, the first bridge from Staten Island to a mainland is actually a railroad bridge. If you are crossing the Goethals Bridge from New Jersey to Staten Island and you look to your left, that's the railroad bridge that was functioning for decades. It was built actually by Erastus Wyman, who I mentioned earlier as being a proponent for consolidation. It was built by him, and the B&O is running freight to Staten Island. And so it's actually, there are some of the tunnels, including the one that Highland built, they're hoping they will move both passengers and freight. Now, in terms of the ferries, Staten Island has ferries from multiple locations in the 19th century. There's a ferry from Tottenville across to New Jersey. There are ferries from Port Richmond. There are ferries from, what is now St. George. There are ferries from the Stapleton area, which is sort of the most populated area of Staten Island, to both Manhattan and to Brooklyn. The Verrazzano Bridge is opening. Slowly, those ferries close. But there's still a ferry to Brooklyn that doesn't close until the Verrazano Bridge is open. And once that's open, then there's only one ferry left, and that's the one at St. George to Manhattan. Oh, and the city, that's actually another benefit of consolidation. So the ferries are privately run. They are taken over by the city in, I think, 1905, and the city builds the first ferry terminal at St. George in 1906. So that's another kind of perk. It's another service that joining New York City provides.
And then I know you mentioned something in the book about when the ferry became free, that was a political negotiation.
Yes, that I think I mentioned in the epilogue. The ferry always cost money. I think it was up to 50% in the 90s. But if you look at the returns for the mayoral election, when Rudy Giuliani wins his first term by defeating the incumbent David Dinkins, you see an overwhelming support on Staten Island and a much greater margin than even he had received in 1989. And so in a very real sense, Staten Island is seen as making Rudy Giuliani mayor. And he rewards the island in two ways. One, the ferry becomes free, and two, he's the one who finally promises to close the Fresh Kills landfill, which he does. It's obviously it reopens temporarily after 9/11, but it eventually closes again.
We're waiting for there's some comments and compliments to your talk, but we're waiting for specific questions from the audience. So anyone who wants to add those to the chats, please do, and I'll continue to ply you with questions of my own. So would you suggest then that the bridge kind of is the pivot point between the residential expansion in Staten Island versus its older identity?
So here's what I try. Not exactly. I don't want to diminish the importance of the bridge too much, but I have found, at least on Staten Island, that long-term residents probably give too much explanatory value to the bridge. And that what I'm trying to argue in this book is that a lot of basic things about Staten Island are established prior to the bridge and stem from its lack of access to the subway system. And that's not to say that the bridge doesn't matter. Of course it does. And in fact, in sheer numbers, the 1960s are the decade with the single largest growth in terms of sheer numbers. The population grows by about 70,000. It hasn't grown by that much in any decade before or since. So there's no doubt that the bridge has some impact. And I fully expect, this is the beauty of history, I fully expect somebody's going to read my book and be dissatisfied that I've diminished the role of the bridge too much, and will push back and kind of make an argument showing all the ways in which the bridge has, in fact, changed Staten Island. And I welcome it. I'm sure it has changed Staten Island in ways that I hadn't considered. But, from my vantage point, a lot had been established on Staten Island that was pretty formative, that predated the bridge. And so that's the case I'm trying to make.
Mm-hmm. And how about the other state? How about New Jersey and the relationship to Staten Island?
So, New Jersey, right? There's this apocryphal, a lot of people, when they look at that first map that I show and they see how close New Jersey is to Staten Island, right? The Arthur Kill and drawing a blank, I know it like the back of my hand, the Kill Van Kull are really narrow passages. And so when you think of it in terms of proximity, you would say, why isn't it part of New Jersey? And there's an apocryphal story that says it was up in the air and there was a race between someone representing New Jersey and someone representing New York to sail around the island, and the New York captain won. But the reality is it's a part of New York for two reasons. Well, primarily from history, in terms of it was settled by the Dutch from Manhattan. And the word Staten comes from the word for the Dutch word for estate. And so, folks in Manhattan who had the means, settled or acquired land on Staten Island and large estates there. And that's because it became part, it developed from New York. That's why it's part of New York.
Which is consistent with your overall argument of mass transit and connections to the metropolis that New Jersey was essentially industrial or port,
right,
and industry.
Right. And also it helps explain, so here they are in 1898 sort of saying, let's create the, greater New York, and it'll lead to greater efficiency for the port. But it doesn't do all that much for the port efficiency because, about a third of the port is New Jersey. And so, it's just 23 years later that the Port Authority is established. The idea has been percolating since the mid 1910s, and it finally gets enough political support. And the Port Authority is literally created to prevent inaction because, there's two states and, dozens of localities that make up the Port of New York. And even if it's just New York City on one side, it's still Hoboken and Jersey City and Fort Lee and all the other places in between, and Bayonne. So, there are too many jurisdictions weighing in from the perspective, again, of business. And, ironically, because, we don't live in an era where we generally turn towards government, right? I still think, the Reagan Revolution had its effect. But this is a period where, businessmen are talking about literally, quote, ruinous competition, unquote, right? Here we, compare that to notions that just say the free market is always more efficient than any kind of public bureaucracy. But the Port Authority is actually established out of the sense that, the businesses can't help themselves with this ruinous competition, and that you need an entity that's able to look at the bigger picture. And the last thing, to bring it back to your question about New Jersey, Carol, the Port Authority in some ways is an entity, or in its early years, it's an entity in search of a mission, because its initial task is to try to create greater efficiency among the freight rail lines, right? In the 1920s, it's not U.S. Steel that's the big corporation. The biggest corporation in the country in the early part of the 20th century is the Pennsylvania Railroad. But there are, half a dozen other railroads moving freight to different parts of New York City. And they all stop at the Jersey shore, and then they have to ferry things across. And so there's hope to kind of create greater efficiency among those trunk lines. And the railroads don't want any part of it, right? They don't have a culture of cooperation. They have a culture of competition. And so the Port Authority is kind of stymied in a major part of its mission. And it almost stumbles upon bridges for the automobiles when it builds the Goethals Bridge and the Outer Bridge Crossing, and then a few years later, the Bayonne Bridge. And those bridges are built in the late 20s and opened in the late 20s. And it kind of almost discovers this mission.
We have
by failing at, by being unable to actually achieve its intended purpose. Mm-hmm. There's a great Empire on the Hudson is a great book by Jameson Doig. And if you're interested in the Port Authority, I rely on it a lot, and in my book, and I highly recommend it.
And of course, they just celebrated their own centennial and published a book which I think is not generally available in bookstores, but it goes for kind of pictorial history of their various transportation systems. So here's a question from the audience, from Nan Sussman. Please, she knows what she's talking about, I think here. Please discuss the succession movement championed by Senator Markey. Did this have any transportation aspects?
Not so much. Thank you, Nan, for your question. Nan is a former colleague from CSI. We were deans together. So I'm so glad you could join us, Nan. And the spark for that, I mean, Markey probably always, his interest predates this, but the movement doesn't actually get any legs that lead to those polls I shared with you until the Board of Estimate and Apportionment, which was the governing body of New York City with real power for, since consolidation, is declared unconstitutional in ways that are not to Staten Island's advantage. And it's declared unconstitutional. And I don't recall who sort of launched the case against it, but it's declared unconstitutional for the one vote, one person rule or philosophy, because its members all have, it's made up of the 5 borough presidents, the mayor, the comptroller, and the president of the Board of Aldermen. So there was an entity like the city council, but not nearly as powerful because this Board of Estimate existed. And on that body, the mayor, the 3 citywide figures each have 3 votes. The borough presidents of Brooklyn and Manhattan have 2 votes. And the borough presidents of Staten Island, the Bronx, and Queens each have 1 vote. Well, I already shared with you the populations in 1930. The margins don't decrease much over the next 50 years. And so this system that gave the same amount of power on that body to Staten Island as to the Bronx and to Queens is declared unconstitutional. And that's why we don't have any body like that in New York City. And so Staten Island kind of recognized that it now is just going to have representation, 2 or 3 seats in a 50+ person city council. And so that was a real loss of power for the island. And that's what generates enough widespread support that the movement gets legs. The dump didn't help either.
Mm-hmm. Another question from Stephen Shelton. Any thoughts on what things would look like now if they did get a subway?
Great question. I got to give a shout out to Steve, who's participating from North Carolina, and is an old friend of mine. So, I have a colleague who's professor of finance, but he's a real expert in the finance of transportation. He's probably the island's leading advocate for rapid transit. At this point, he's not arguing for a subway, but he's pushing for rapid transit to go over the Bayonne Bridge and to connect with the light rail in Bayonne. And so at least it would be a rapid transit link to Manhattan that way, and reopening the North Shore. I mean, I think at this point, Staten Island, its development, I don't think a subway would change much. I mean, the reality is it has spread out. It's too it's too based on home ownership, and home ownership, or even these duplexes that became very common in the last 30 years, it doesn't generate enough density the way an apartment building, or even, a 4 or 5 story, brownstone or tenement does. So I think at this point, a subway is just not likely to happen. And if it did, maybe in the long run, it would have an impact if, people started building up at the various subway stations. That could conceivably happen. I mean, you look at Staten Island now, and even the areas by the Staten Island rapid transit stops are a little bit more compressed, probably a little bit denser than some outlying areas. But yeah, there's not a lot of height on Staten Island.
Density is usually a function of zoning. What is the zoning in Staten Island? I'm sure it's various, and you do have multi-story buildings.
It varies. I mean, but a lot of it is residential. And I think the biggest criticism about zoning from, let's call them density advocates, is that it's single purpose zoning. So, most areas that are dense, right? And you picture a dense part of Manhattan with a store in the bottom and residences atop. Most parts of the, have multiple use or variable use zoning. And I don't think that's all that common on Staten Island. And that would have to change also, I think, to
encourage density. But also, the zones come later. I mean, not that much later, but the earliest subways predate the impact of the earliest zones, which I think the first zoning law is 1916.
Right.
But it's not, a lot's going to change over time in the next decades. I'm sure your audience with for this museum, I'm sure it better than I do.
1916 first zoning law, and then the revisions in 1961, which generally downzoned the amount of buildable space. But I'm not that familiar with Staten Island's zoning for residential districts and how many stories.
It's most. I mean, I couldn't give you numbers, but it's mostly residential.
Mm-hmm. Is there much activity in Staten Island to petition the city to upzone, or
I don't know whether there's the petition of the city to upzone. I mean, most of the development activity on Staten Island, has been along the kind of the east shore, the north and east, particularly the east, kind of in between, let's say, St. George, which is where the ferry goes, and then moving east towards Stapleton, and a little bit beyond. And there are some kind of gentrified developments there. And, I think they've done okay, but they've never, people have been talking about like St. George gentrifying for, as long as I've been at the college, and I got here in 1995, probably as long as Nan was at the college and she got there before me. And it's never quite gentrified the way people had thought it might.
Another comment, so I guess we'll see if you agree or disagree. Jordan Auslander says, I think it's a statement, the Port Authority was created in the 1920s to build a trans-Hudson rail freight crossing and built the World Trade Center instead. So, of course, there was the Hudson in Manhattan, too.
Exactly. So there's a lot that happens in between the World Trade Center and the failure to build that Trans-Hudson. But thank you for elaborating on that. That's what I was alluding to when I kind of said all the freight rails kind of stop. And I didn't include it in this PowerPoint, but I actually have a map in the book that shows you where all the terminals are. And they all stop on the Jersey Shore. And one of the reasons why the Highland Tunnel, the one that the mayor broke ground for, that it gets blocked, is because the Pennsylvania Railroad has at that point built up a big freight area in Greenville, New Jersey, which is not across from Manhattan. It's actually across from, kind of Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And it saw no reason to go through Staten Island, which wouldn't help it. But actually talked about building a tunnel from Greenville, New Jersey, to directly to Brooklyn, bypassing Staten Island. Now that never gets built either, and so it's not clear to me how serious they are at doing that, or whether it really is just a kind of a red herring to discourage the Narrows Tunnel project.
I have one more question here, but I can see in my chat there's a number. There are two, I think, questions, but they're going to be too small for me to read. So somebody didn't follow the instructions. If you have not had your question answered, please address it to the Skyscraper Museum instead, and then I'll get it here on my phone in a large and readable format. So Mike C wants to know, who is doing a little comparative urbanism here, because he must be in Washington. He says density in the DC area hasn't been an issue with the subway here. It goes way out into the suburbs now, and you see growth around those stations. And I guess we could pair this with another question or observation was, should density be encouraged, and would that be an incentive to improve mass transit?
So from my perspective, from an environmental perspective, I think density has to be encouraged. I think that, the way we have spread out as a society and use so much land for, residences is ultimately not sustainable for the planet. But I think that, and the comparison to DC is a point well taken, because I think as certainly the commenter knows, but maybe the audience doesn't, DC built its subway relatively late. Am I right in thinking it's opens in the 70s? So there is that would be an interesting kind of comparison. I think right now, the MTA, there's just no stomach for it. I mean, the MTA is constantly struggling to sort of make things work. Right now, New York's about to embrace congestion pricing, which was dead on arrival 10 years ago or so when Bloomberg first proposed it. But now it looks like it might very well happen. And that's all designed to kind of help provide money for the MTA. The cost of running the subways is not covered by the fares that it generates. And the ridership on the New York City subway, I believe, peaked in the post-World War II years. And it's never been as high since then. And, scholars talk about the riding habit as being necessary. So it would be very interesting to me to see how Washington DC developed the riding habit. As someone who spent the summer living in Rockville, Maryland, and took the subway down because I was working at the U.S. Department of Education, I took the metro down, so I know exactly what the listener is referring to. And there definitely is a ridership, and you have to build that habit, and you have to, I think, be willing to accept a certain amount of losses until the habit is built.
Well, building subways are always expensive, phenomenally expensive,
Yes.
but tunnels even more so, and
Yes.
especially long ones.
Yes. But I really do think, that's the one advantage of Staten Island, at least in terms of, limiting a project. One of the listeners I know didn't follow instructions, but put on my chat, can you talk about the prospects for a tunnel today? I don't think they're good, but again, I think Staten Island has to really kind of make the case. We don't need the lines on the island, at least initially. We just need a tunnel that connects to the lines that we already have.
Well, maybe we could get Amtrak to send some trains through there, and then we would at least have some redundancy against the doomsday scenario that is always reminded. We are always reminded of by the Regional Plan Association how vulnerable our lives all hang by a thin thread of a metal circle through which any time disappear. So
Yes.
So maybe we could sell the federal government on bailing us out with it.
So I moved to New Jersey about 15 years ago. So I'm from Brooklyn, and I know that right. So I still blame our former governor, Chris Christie. The federal government had provided 90% of the funding for a third tunnel to Manhattan, and Christie refused the project.
Mm-hmm. We talked about politics throughout the night in terms of all of the scenarios that you gave us of what might have been. You're a fountain of knowledge, and you're I love the metaphor of trying to drink out of a fire hydrant in terms of both the volume and the speed of your delivery and your answers to these questions. So it was an extremely rich evening of history of Staten Island, and for a lot of us who are not your colleagues of long standing, but rather people who seek to know about the Forgotten Borough, you really helped us tonight. So thank you for a great talk.
And if anyone has any follow-up, just Google my name and email me at the college. I'd be happy to, converse further. But thank you all for coming.
We love enlarging our audience in terms of the people and their locations, but also the materials that we cover. And you've really helped us tonight, Ken, in order to bring all of the boroughs into our purview. So once again, thanks everybody for being with us, and we hope to see you next time, which would be next Tuesday. So good night, everybody.
Thank you and good night.